You can ask some friends, which I did. I got lots of recommendations. But what to watch? I mean, it's an important decision, right? And not really, but sort of. So shows or movies might be too scary, too serious, might be boring, it might have poor acting. There's a lot of factors that go into a decision before you actually click play. And with too many choices, we ended up watching Bad Moms. Now, what I hope you're thinking right now is there was too much choice, so you must have chosen something that you'd already seen. And that's exactly what's right in this case. Now, I think this movie's pretty good. I've probably seen it about 8 times, but the point isn't whether or not a movie is good or whether or not something is good. The point is that this is the safe choice. It's one that we made because there was too much choice. And with an inability to make decision, we landed on something that we knew would be okay. We all want choice, or maybe it's actually that we want to feel like we have choice. Really what I wanted was to be able to pick something new that I would be entertained by, but I got stuck making a decision. In his 2004 book, psychologist Barry Schwartz argues that limiting choice can reduce anxiety and that abundance of choice often leads to depression and feelings of loneliness. That's not really the point. The TLDR in this context is that while we want optionality, we can benefit from having fewer options or by placing some boundaries. This holds when you're picking a movie or you're selecting an ice cream flavor or even when you're building a software project. And there's something to keep in mind, which is that we already accept these boundaries. The key is that we accept the boundaries so long as they line up with our own preferences, right? So many companies, Shopify included, will declare that they are Mac shops, right? We exclusively use Mac hardware. For most of our developers, this isn't an issue. In fact, for most of the people that come to this is not an issue. And that's because we would choose to use a MacBook. This is the choice for many of the developers and many of the other people at the company. This is true for language choice as well. And it can be true when we're joining an external project or a company. We look at what language is in use at the company and we make a choice, and part of our decision to join the company is around that language. So the fact that the company is standardized on a language isn't an issue because it aligns with our preference. So keep that piece of preference in mind. All of this is really getting at a fact that we have limited cognitive energy to make decisions. That's limited brain power. There's only so many decisions that we can make in a day. We need to limit our choice. This is actually the paradox of choice, that too much choice and we become paralyzed. We're unable to move forward. There's also an idea of too many choices in a day because we only have so many and we're unable to make any more useful decisions. If you've heard of this idea of startup founders who wear a black t-shirt every single day, this is the reason why. It's to make that decision about what to wear once and then execute it on every day without having to remake that decision. So back to that MacBook example, we don't want a debate about what computer to use. We just want a great machine. Spending weeks of time researching options when you join a company is not a good use of your time or the company's time. But there's lots of things that we bike shed on, right? And bike shedding is when you spend lots of time arguing about the merits of something that's otherwise trivial or relatively unimportant, doesn't have a lot of impact. So the idea with the bike shed is it's what color to paint the bike shed, but this is also a debate that I see frequently with something like tabs versus spaces. So this is waste of both time and cognitive energy when it comes to the company. We want to free our decision-making power for things that matter more. Ultimately, all these decisions will allow us to focus our work, right? Whatever is associated with the current project that we're working on, and to get to thinking about it faster. This is something that our CEO, Toby, tweeted out a while back, and it's really stuck with me as a way to think about this. So as Toby said, you have 5 useful hours in each day, and we want the most out of the 4 that we get at Shopify. Right? So Shopify wants 4 and we want to get the most out of that. And part of getting the most out of that is really being able to focus on the work that has the highest impact and limiting the decisions that we have to make. All right, I haven't given myself an intro, so where do I fit into all this? So hi, I'm Lawrence Mandel. I'm the somewhat adult-sized person in this photo with the kids. In addition to being a dad, I run Shopify's developer acceleration team. A bit more about me, I used to run Firefox global releases through our release and productivity team. I also worked at IBM, where I spent most of my time working on projects that I founded at Eclipse and Apache. And I want to tell you a bit about this company that I work for, Shopify. So Shopify is a commerce company. Commerce is the act of 2 people or entities exchanging items of value like goods, services, or money. You may think of Shopify as an online store, but that's not really it. It exists to make commerce better for everyone. And we're about building businesses. So at Shopify, we're building the commerce operating system. That's the way that we refer to it. And you can see this in our online stores, in our retail point of sale hardware, our sales channels integrations with companies like Amazon, Walmart, Facebook, and Pinterest, as well as our fulfillment centers. The point of all of this is to give you the context to see that building the commerce operating system will take a lot of people. And Shopify's R&D team is currently around 2,000 people. All right, back to developer acceleration. So if we look at developer acceleration as a team within Shopify, our mission is to make commerce developers highly productive. And I often explain this, that our teams are here to scale engineering. So we build an amazing developer experience through tooling, best practices, frameworks, libraries, languages, and shared context. And this includes everything from when you start coding locally to getting a change into production and managing your production infrastructure. It's internal frameworks to open source work on Ruby and Rails. It's our developer handbook and project documentation to events like our weekly developer talks and our annual developer summit. Again, all of these are tactics that we use to scale engineering by making commerce developers highly productive. All right, so coming back to the topic now that you have the context about the environment in which I'm working. There are many ways that you can think about scaling an engineering team. And I want to address technology choice as that fits in with this idea of constraint. So there are two paths that a company can go down in this regard. This is heterogeneous versus homogeneous environments. And in heterogeneous environments, you allow any language, tool, framework into your environment. This is really optimizing for the team, and the team is making these decisions. And integrations between the teams are happening in the microservices world via APIs, HTTP calls, right? These are the boundaries that we set. But the key here is that each team makes their own decisions. The other way is to make technology decisions for everyone at the company level, to be opinionated about what technology is in use at the company. So at Shopify, we say we're a Rails shop, and that's the shop that's on the right. Or another way of saying we're a Rails shop is to say that we're opinionated about the technology that we use, and we all use the same. This is the primary tactic that we have for scaling engineering, being opinionated. Our opinions are expressed as decisions. So we make company level decisions, like being a Rails shop, and we apply them to all teams. This type of environment naturally supports the decision to go with a monolithic application, which is what Shopify is. So Shopify's opinionated technology, some of it is that our web stack is React plus GraphQL plus Rails. And on mobile, we default to React Native. We run our infrastructure on Google Cloud Platform. We have one continuous integration system, Shopify Build. One deployment system, Ship It. One corollary to being opinionated about tech choice is that once you made a choice, you need to decommission anything off that path and stick with that choice. And we'll get into this a bit more. But there's outsized value in getting from 95% to 100% and turning something off. All right, so back to decisions. Once we made these decisions are expressed as constraints on our system and on our teams. We write down the justification for decisions in our dev handbook so that we can learn from each other and understand the source of decisions. Understanding decisions is really important because we need to understand the assumptions so that ultimately we can challenge decisions, which we'll go into in a little bit. So viewing this together, we have that opinion leads to decision, which leads to constraint. And it's constraint that I say drives automation and quality. Constraint is the key in all of this. So we need to get to the point where we can define what that constraint is. And the reason that constraint benefits us is it drives standardization, it limits surface area for what we build, and it pushes consistency. And all of this leads to more useful and more advanced automation. So next, I want to show you examples of each of these in the tools that we built internally at Shopify. So you can see how this manifests itself into actual tools and automation. What you're looking at here is Services DB. So every service at Shopify has a set of requirements or constraints placed on it. These constraints are encoded in Services DB as service checks, and that's what you can see on this list. So these service checks improve our resiliency by ensuring that services follow best practices, right? But the best practices, again, are best practices because we've made decisions. So at the top of this list, you can see that every service needs an on-call rotation to be defined. Key for resiliency, so we know who to talk to in case there's an issue. In the middle of the list, you can see the Ruby version. We want to ensure that all of our services are keeping up to date. This is important for reasons like security and consistency, which we'll talk about next, but it's also for simplicity for the resiliency team, right? We limit the paths that they have to take by limiting the number of instances that are in production. And at the bottom, you can see our Semian gems. These gems implement best practices, in this case, from MySQL and Redis. And these are resiliency best practices. So using these gems shares this resiliency knowledge so that all services and all teams at Shopify benefit. It also means that when we create something new, a new best practice, we can embed it in these gems and it percolates out, it gets out to all of the services that exist at Shopify. And everything listed here, and the list, as you can see when it was scrolling, is much longer than this, is a limitation or constraint placed on the system. It's also a way for us to encode decisions that are made once and pushed out to all of Shopify, as we said, so we don't have to learn the same lessons over and over again in each team. There's a side point I want to make here, given that we're talking about tools and quality, and that's that quality assurance practices I typically see in quality assurance teams focus on test execution. So it focuses on test planning and test execution. And I think that quality and quality assurance is actually much broader than that. And this is an example of where you can build quality into the system without actually having a test plan in place for it. It's a different way. And so I'd encourage quality assurance teams to think about the overall quality and the different levers that can be pulled. Before we leave this tool specifically, I'll just ask that you note that first item on the list, dev setup automation, because we're going to see where this is related to a tool in a minute. All right, the second item that I said is constraint limit surface area. And what I mean about surface area is how broadly and the optionality that we have to build into our tools. So this is really important and has been key for us to build higher value tools more quickly. So what you're looking at here is Ship It Mobile. This tool defines our mobile release process for all mobile applications at Shopify. That's iOS and Android native applications and newer React Native based applications as well. The tool integrates with App Center, where we push it for internal testing. It also integrates with CI to pull the required build artifacts and the iOS and Play stores for pushing to production. In the screenshot, you can see that we've got release-specific information, such as the release captain, and links out to useful tools like GitHub so that we can see which PRs are included in a release. So when we look at how we built this tool, the mobile tooling team went out to speak with all of the mobile teams at Shopify. One of the things that we learned from speaking with those teams is that there were some subtle differences, but this is going back to those differences that are preferences but don't have a material impact at Shopify. So for example, we found that each team was actually using a different default branch name. So one team was using master, another was using main, a third was using dev. Having these different names wasn't a problem, right? It was something that the team selected to do and they could make that preference. There wasn't a reason to consolidate, right? They had a preference. But using the same at this point, now that we wanted to build a tool around it, did provide benefit. The benefit of using the same meant that we didn't have to build the optionality into the tool so that we could configure it for which branch was actually the default branch. It also removed part of the configuration complexity associated with setting up a new tool, a new mobile tool that we were going to release within this tool itself. You might think that building one isn't a big deal, but there were a number of these smaller issues, these smaller changes or differences within the teams. So for example, each team was using a slightly different versioning scheme, but without a real need to do so. And the same thing with the release process. They were similar, but not the same. So by speaking with the teams and getting them to agree on these standards, we were actually able to reduce the scope of what we had to build in terms of the tool. And so that limitation, those limitations that we placed on the tool allowed 3 people to build this in 3 months from the time that we had the idea and started talking with the teams. And within 9 months from having those initial discussions with the teams, every application, every mobile application at Shopify was releasing using this tool. So there's 3 big pieces to take away from the story of developing Ship It Mobile at Shopify. Teams will agree to make changes when it's in their best interest to do so. So they didn't have a reason before, but once we presented them with a reason, they jumped on it. And these decisions are really relationship based. And so it benefits speaking in person or speaking on video versus trying to do this via chat, right? And a lot of this gets back to the trust that we have that we're going to be able to build something useful. The second, we're able to do more by doing less. So fewer options and more complete automation. Again, we did this with a team of 3, and limiting the options is what allowed us to do that. As a side story for this, we regularly talk to a bunch of other tech companies. And in general, these are name brand tech companies that you would recognize. Early in the formation of the mobile tooling team, so this predates the tool that I'm showing you here, the mobile tooling team, we met with another company and we were having a discussion. And through the course of that discussion, we both kind of came to the realization that we were at a similar place with respect to where our mobile tooling was. And they shared with us that they had 6 developers working on their team and wanted to know how many we had. And at that point, we had 1 developer and 1 intern. And so we were able to do with 1 developer and 1 intern what they were doing with 6 full-time developers. And from what I could tell from viewing the tools and what we were talking about, it was really the optionality that allowed us to have that difference. The third takeaway is that we're actually now in a better position because of having the constraint. And this could be seen a short while after the tool was released. One of the teams had an issue with the release. They had an accidental mistaken rebase on one of the release branches and pushed a bad release out to production. And so we looked at this and we came up with a new scheme, a modified scheme, I should say, that included branch protections. And because this one team learned that lesson and we were all using standards, we were able to push that out to all of the teams at Shopify, and all of the mobile teams got the benefit from the mistake and the lesson learned by one team. All right, my third example is consistency, right? The third piece of where constraint helps. So what you're looking at here is dev. This is that tool that I told you to take a look at the top of Services DB. So dev is like magic. It manages your local development environment, setting you up and getting you back in a good state when you get into a bad one. It also provides a set of project agnostic commands. So these are commands that can be used on every project at Shopify. Dev clone to clone the repo, dev up to set up your environment, dev server to launch services locally for web-based projects, dev top hat to run specific change sets for manual testing locally, and dev test to run automated tests. So we have that service check in place because we require every project to be what we call dev enabled. And being dev enabled brings consistency. It allows for muscle memory for everyone who has to interact with code on a project. It reduces onboarding time. If you've ever had this experience of joining a new project and it can take hours, days, sometimes even weeks to get your environment set up so that you can start working, I hope that you'll appreciate the magic of every new developer who starts at Shopify in about an hour has Shopify running locally. And they can get into the code base and start working on it, or they can get into the tests and start working on the tests. So this is big. This is big for us. We onboard a lot of people. But I've got to stress that this isn't just for new employees. Dev makes it easier and encourages people to change projects. And we like to contribute to other projects and encourage people to do so. So on the left here, you can see this consistency as you can see dev up running on the Shopify monolith. And on the right, again, dev up is being used to set up the environment for our ChatOps tool Spy. Different tools, different requirements, same command. Once again, this is good for resiliency, as any dev can jump in and help debug production issues and work on solutions with dev clone and dev up to get running very quickly. And we've recently been working on improving reliability and performance to keep up with our growth by rebasing this tool on Nix. This is a whole other discussion that I'm not going to get into here, but I do want to share it because I think it's exciting. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing specifically with Nix and with dev, you can read more about it on our blog at engineering.shopify.com. All right, at this point, maybe you're asking, is this working? But of course, the whole point of me giving this talk is I'm sharing that this is working, right? And again, 83% of our devs think that our tools are better than those that they've used at previous companies. I hope that you now have an idea about why. It feels a bit like bragging to say this, but at the same point, I think it's an important point to get across, and that's why I'm sharing this with you. Environment setup for new devs at Shopify is about an hour. Switching projects is trivial, comfortable, and encouraged. You don't need to know anything, know everything rather, to ship services and apps that scale to production. And at Shopify, we talk about being a technical company. And to us, that means that everyone can contribute. And in fact, we see contributions from our C-suite on down. So at the bottom, you can see a message from our COO, Harley. Harley doesn't have a development background, but our tools are simple enough to use that he's able to make small changes to a number of our projects. And on the top, you can see a tweet from our CTO, JML, about a change that he made during our recent hack days only a couple of weeks ago. The tweet happens to reinforce that we love the Majestic monolith as well, so that's a nice alignment with what I've been talking about here. So yes, this works, and this can go horribly wrong. And I've seen it firsthand outside of Shopify. So let's talk about that for a minute. There are issues to watch out for when using constraint. And I want to talk about three here: dictating, entrenched positions, and risk aversion. So dictating is coming off high and mighty, right? Telling other teams what you're going to do at the company and telling them the way that things are going to be. The thing that I would ask you to remember is that this is not about you. This is about the partnership with whoever you're building tooling and automation for. Right? You need to partner with those teams and work together in order for them to accept the constraint and to move forward. Now, I talked about us having opinions, and really we have strong opinions, but this requires a balance, right? Having opinions means that we also need to weekly hold those opinions, and the weekly held opinion is really about the idea of being able to change opinions. And this is especially true when there's changing assumptions, right? So I talked about how we write down the reasons behind our decisions and the assumptions in our dev handbook. So there are changing assumptions like we've recently had with the pandemic. As an example, setting up an environment in dev takes a lot of prereqs, right? These are big projects, and those prereqs need to be downloaded. One of our assumptions had been that everyone would be pretty much on an office quality internet connection, at least the majority. And now we're looking at the impact of what it means to have everybody working from home and everybody working on home residential-based internet connections. The last one that's on here, risk aversion, I think is broader than constraint, but it does apply to constraint. So it's easy to get into this mode of iterative improvement and believe that what we've invested in building needs to be maintained. This gets back to the entrenched positions as well. At some point though, in your journey, you're gonna need step changes in your tooling. This generally happens when enough assumptions change, like working from home or the size of the team substantially changing, or perhaps now you're hiring a lot more juniors, or perhaps actually you're hiring a lot more seniors and they need something different. So the lesson here is be willing to let go of what you built, even if it's been great. There's some signs for all of these as well. And so signs that things are going wrong. People aren't excited to use your tools and they're not engaging with you on the issues that they're encountering with them, right? You're getting radio silence or you're not seeing a lot of usage. Alternatively, you could be getting a lot of pushback. Maybe people are using it or maybe they aren't using it, but there's lots of challenges for you. And ultimately, people working around you, picking and adopting other tools. And for this last one, be very careful if you get to this state, because this is a very difficult state to get out of with your team. It means that the trust that your team has with the other teams is very low. And once they find valuable external tools, it really brings into question, what is the value that you're building? There's something else in this slide specifically, and that's that I used Mario. And I used him for the example because Mario is known to be the hero. And what I would challenge you to think about is that whether you're the hero or the villain is really a matter of perspective. And so you can think of yourself as the hero, but other teams may think of you as the villain. And it really depends on, again, getting back to that partnership, understanding, and working together with others and building for impact on all the teams. Or put another way, we need to be able to challenge decisions. We need to accept others challenging our decisions, and we need to be able to challenge our own decisions. When it comes to tech, we at Shopify encourage people to challenge by trying new things at our quarterly hack days, right? This is when we can experiment. And so two things that were pretty big that have come out of this. One was our decision to move to the cloud, which came out of work that was experimental work, and React Native as our default for mobile development. React Native is actually very interesting in that we ran an experiment several years ago and concluded at that time, the decision was that this wasn't the right technology choice for us. And then several years later, we experimented again, and then actually made the decision that this was the right technology decision for us. So decisions, and again, assumptions can change. So large scale changes like these, though, can't be adopted lightly. The case needs to be clear, and we need to make an explicit decision. But like I was saying earlier, once we make that decision, we need to go all in and focus on this path. And do we get any pushback even though things are working well? Absolutely. I mean, 83% is not 100%. We're not going to please everybody all of the time. A specific example that just happened last month was that we've decided on a course for what our default test framework is going to be. So historically, we supported both Minitest and RSpec, and we didn't have a reason to pick one or the other. Support for both was really, it didn't take a lot of work, so we did it. And some teams use one and some teams use the other. But our test infrastructure team has been doing a lot more work recently with test automation, and specifically with selective test execution and automatic detection of intermittently failing tests. Those are flaky tests. And so the work that they're doing here is really to reduce the feedback loop, which is a common pain point expressed at Shopify, and really a common pain point that I see expressed at lots of companies. And so we have good reason to do this work, but the team has found that they're duplicating a bunch of their efforts supporting both RSpec and Minitest. And so that doesn't make sense, and it doesn't fit with our philosophy. This is a time to form an opinion. We didn't have a good reason to pick one framework over the other. We did come up with a reason, and we selected Minitest. Now, as expected, this didn't please everybody, right? You could be on one side of the fence or the other here. And so some of the reactions that we got were, RSpec is clearly better in my opinion. All I want is context blocks. RSpec reads follows way easier. Or even, I'm just sad, I love everything about RSpec. And really what you need to look at here is that there's validity in the criticism. Some of this is preference, which is valid, and some of this is actually ways in which RSpec can be seen as better than Minitest. And so our team was committed to partnering with teams to understand this. We set up a Slack channel and had these discussions. We've taken away a number of items that we can then go off and improve in mini-test or improve in our implementation, right? These are ways to improve the lives of developers, improve the lives of people writing tests. But we need to be clear about what those were, and we need to be clear that we need to make a decision, right? And we need to form an opinion so that we can all go further. There's a precondition for everything that I've been talking about, and it's kind of just under the covers, and I've used the word trust a few times. But the precondition for all relationships, including those between teams, is trust. And so in the team sense, we build trust by engaging and partnering with other teams, listening to their concerns, working with them, and most importantly, showing value. So we've done a lot of great work at Shopify, and our trust battery, a term that we use a lot at Shopify, is fully charged with the team. But this hasn't always been the case, and as we branch out into new areas, this won't always be a case. Using the mobile tooling team as an example again, when this team was just forming, they came up with a great idea for how to change the way that we do automated builds and how we were going to do local builds as well for mobile tools. And it required a change in workflow for mobile developers, and they went out and they followed that anti-pattern of dictating that I talked about, and they got a lot of pushback. In fact, this was not accepted by the mobile teams. And so the mobile tooling team, as a set of individuals, it was again 2 people at a time, were pretty demoralized by this. But they realized that the trust wasn't there, right? And we worked around to understanding that. And so the way that they worked through this is providing smaller scale pieces of value over the series of months until they worked back up to having a discussion and partnering with the teams on the direction for Ship It Mobile. And then they built and delivered Ship It Mobile, which has seen real value at Shopify. And now their trust battery is really fully charged with those teams. And they have a lot of leeway, and they're working on a lot of great tools. If you follow Pedro, who works on my team, Pedro Panera, he's sharing a bunch of this work on Twitter. And so you can see the direction that the team is going. And all of this wraps us back around to where we started about preference. So constraints aren't seen in a poor light if they're actually the individual's preference. So you really want your tools to become the preference of the individuals. And to do that, your tools need to be great. I can't emphasize this enough. Our devs choose to use Dev. They choose to use Ship It Mobile. They choose to use Services DB. Like these are great tools. And even tools that former devs who have left told us that they wish they still had. In fact, I'm going to share one case where a developer left and a few months later decided to come back. And this is something that I had never seen before. So when they were coming back, one of their stated reasons for coming back was that they said they were able to accomplish so much more at Shopify because the tooling was so much more advanced than where they had gone. Now, I never thought that like a tooling and automation team could actually be a reason for someone to join a company that the tools would be that good, but that's at the point. That's what this individual felt. I'm not saying I did like a happy dance, but that was pretty exciting for me to hear. I haven't heard that again since. It's only one case, but it was a pretty exciting case and pretty exciting for the team to hear about it also. So to make your tools the preference, I really think you need to think about them as products. And this is a subject of an entirely different talk, but think of them as products because you're competing against commercial offerings that are products, that have entire product teams devoted to them. And if those tools are better, you should use those tools. So let's talk just briefly about the dev acceleration approach here. So in DevExcel, we buy what's generic and we focus on the value add for Shopify. I mentioned this earlier as something to watch out for. So you want to be objective about what you're building, right? Because you really want to build something of value and make good use of your time. And remember that just because you can build something doesn't mean that you should. It can be both time and cost effective to buy a tool from someone else. Time, again, is your most limiting factor. Remember, you only have 5 useful hours in each day. We at Shopify only want 4 of those hours. So we need to make the greatest impact that we can. The scope of our team, it may seem broad from what I was describing before, but it's actually fairly narrow. There's lots of areas that I would love to get into, like editor integration, staging environments, exception management, and more advanced PR tools. But we're keeping the scope narrow deliberately, and even within the teams, we keep the scope narrow. We don't do everything around test automation. We have specific projects and specific focus areas that we work on. And we talk about focusing on the 80% case, or that what we build should be useful to the majority of commerce developers. So if I summarize, the core tenets of developer acceleration are that we build products, or put another way, we build great tools. And we keep our scope narrow in order to do so. It's better to build fewer great tools than more mediocre tools. We buy when we can, and we build when we provide additional value. And we build for that 80% case. It should work for the majority. All right, what are your take homes? So like movies or ice cream, I think you want choice with boundaries for your technology. Be opinionated, because opinions drive decisions, which in turn drive constraint. And constraint drives automation and quality through standards, limited surface area, and consistency. Build trust and make your products the preference of your developers. And in doing so, you'll delight them and you'll have lots of trust. And this works. Now, this is the point where I would normally say thank you and we would move on to questions, but I have something else in mind that I'd like you to go along with for me. So I found this tweet online about a week ago. Now, this says, hey, are you a white guy in tech who's thinking of conference speaking? Pitch a soft talk about something like kindness or empathy or teamwork. I'm tired of all the track being about that being the girl track. I want men to start talking about this. So I already had a talk accepted and I wasn't going to pull a bait and switch and change my talk, but I thought I could add on a little bonus talk at the end here about this. So I'm gonna go and do that. What I would ask you to do, I'm not sure how many people are here right now, but I would ask you, there's enough of us where I think we can make an impact on this person who sent this out and show them that we're doing this. I'm going to tweet this out that I'm about to do this to Sweet Pavement. I'm Mandel. I would encourage you to do the same to show them something positive happening on Twitter. So I've gone ahead and sent out a tweet to them. I'll give you 5 more seconds to pull down those usernames. And if you're not sure, if you search for Mandel, you'll see my tweet as well. And with that, I'm going to give you a bit of what I'm going to call a bonus presentation here about focusing on impact. And this is a career-based discussion or presentation that's going to be pretty short to use up the remaining presentation time that I have here. And hopefully the conference organizers won't cut me off. So we want to focus on impact. And so I think it's important to start with the definition of this because I've been having this conversation ongoing for quite some time in my management team, and this has been something that's hard to lock down. So for the purposes here, I'm going to go with have a strong effect on someone or something. And in our case, we're talking about having a strong effect on your business. So you want to make a dent or leave your mark. But this can be challenging to figure out what there is to do. You know, how can I know what's going to have a strong effect on the business? And so I want to give you 3 ways to think about how to do this. And these are things that I wish people had told me earlier in my career. So number 1, know the core of your role. That's the yellow circle that you can see here. So we all have something that's at the core of what it is that we're here to do. It's what the business hired us to do. For software developers, this is typically going to be technical contribution through code. For QA engineers, this may be the responsibility for quality control and a release. For me, this is leadership and growth of development practices that effectively scale engineering. The blue circles represent activities that contribute, but they're not core to your role. So things like blog posts, conference talks, they fall in this category for most of us. This also includes things like organizing team social events, but it can include technical projects as well. So one person on my team was working on a project that was building creative interactive maps for the floors in our offices. And another one was working on one to do an internal advertising campaign to promote tools that we build that weren't well known. The takeaway from this is that these blue circle activities are valuable. They contribute to the impact that you can have on the business, but only, and this is key, only if you do your core role, again, what the business hired you to do. So never lose sight of your core when you're doing these activities. All right, number 2, look up. I find most people are focused on their immediate team. So if you want to find ways to have impact, look at the team above you. So ask your manager, what are their priorities? And look at the priorities of the adjacent teams, your adjacent teams, and find the common ground. Also find the work that doesn't neatly fall into one of the teams. Perhaps this is work that's falling through the cracks. For managers, something that I stress to all of the people on my management team is that their first team is their team of peer managers. Their area of responsibility is what most people naturally think of as their team. But I want you to think of this as the team above you, not the team below you. So looking up will give you a different perspective and put the work of your team in a different perspective as well. All right, number 3, meet new people. Many of us feel most natural just keeping to ourselves. So meeting new people can be scary, like you can see here. Humans are social creatures. Work is a social activity and includes a community. Meeting other people opens up new lines of thinking and new opportunities. So make a point of meeting new people and being part of that community, even if it doesn't feel comfortable to do so. One approach that has worked for me has been to set a goal to meet a new person each week. Shopify makes this really easy as we have an internal program known as Sidekicks, where I'm automatically matched up with someone random within the company each week. And then we have a conversation and we get to meet. You can set up something like this for yourself, but you can also just reach out and meet someone new in another way. Again, I understand that this can be uncomfortable. It's working yourself through that discomfort because there's value. And the value that I think you get out of this and being part of the community is that if you share your opinions and listen for feedback, the feedback can help you further refine your opinion. People also typically have, often enough, have new resources that they can share as well that can help you understand more what you're working on. And so you can also do this in a larger setting, like I'm doing right now with this. So I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation, and it's a way where I'm sharing an opinion, and I hope to hear feedback from all of you about this. So we learn from others. So my suggestion here is to aim to increase your exposure to others, and by having additional interactions with other people, you're going to increase your opportunities to learn. So that's it. That's your short bonus presentation. Increase your impact by knowing the core of your role and ensuring that you do your job well. Look up to identify opportunities from your manager and from adjacent teams, and meet new people in order to learn from them and find new opportunities for yourself and for your team. And with that, at this point, I will say, thank you for listening. As I said, I do hope that this is a continued discussion. We have some time for questions now, but you've got my Twitter handle there as well, and we can continue this discussion on Twitter. I would love your feedback on this. As I just said, this is a reason for sharing these types of opinions. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jay, who can moderate some Q&A for us. Thank you.
Awesome, Lawrence. Thanks for the great talk. I think we have a bunch of questions for you. Let's start going through them. So first question, was Shopify always this opinionated about your tech stack from day one? When did you apply this policy, and how much tech debt needed to be paid to get out of there?
Yeah, Shopify has been a Rails shop since day one. And so Shopify has grown up Rails, and I think implicitly we had some of these assumptions there. And yeah, as long as I have been in the company and well predating me, Shopify has had this opinion. So I don't know if it was actually Toby's intention on day one, one of our founders, that this was what we would do, but we were pretty opinionated that we were a Rails shop, and we have very selectively let in other pieces of technology in select areas when they're needed. But yeah, we are very opinionated about what we use, and we consolidate on that. And when people diverge, we really work to get back to the common standards that we have.
Got it. Another question, who decides which technologies to use? What's the process that you follow typically?
Sure. So this is one that's come up a lot, right? Like, how do you actually change a decision about a technology stack like this? So some of the things to think through are, what's the impact on the business? Like, are we adopting this for the right reasons? Are we going to be able to get like a 10 times increase in something by doing this? Or is it only an incremental increase that we're looking at? Because the cost is really substantial. Even if you only look at the singular cost of retraining an entire engineering team on a new set of technology, the cost is pretty substantial. So the way that we've done this is really to look at experiments, and Shopify spends a lot of time on experimentation. We like to say that experiments that don't work are the successful discovery of something that doesn't work. So we really encourage experiments, and it's built into our internal project management system as well. But like I was talking about, we have hack days every single quarter, and work comes out of hack days, and that work then can be championed and can go further, but it's sort of starts with an experiment, moves from the kind of really prototype stage into, you know, a bit of a wider use case to prove it out. And then we have to make decisions at a more leadership level to adopt this. Usually you're talking about any change like this is going to have someone behind it. And as we say, if you want to push for a change like this, be ready for it to take the next 2 to 3 years of your life to push a change like through the business. So you really have to commit to be willing to do so. So trying to get back to the actual question, I actually think it's a combination of bottom up and top down, where you have this being pushed bottom up with a champion or stakeholder that's really trying to push for the adoption of the technology. And you need to get the buy-in from senior engineering leadership in order to make sort of broad scale adoption possible at Shopify.
Awesome. A quick follow-up. This works as a nice follow-up to that question. So you said like 83% of the team is happy. For the 17% that may not sort of be happy when you decide to pick a technology to use, how do you make sure, or what efforts do you pull in to convert them, to turn them into advocates?
Sure. So to clarify those numbers, so 83% of our developers think our tools are better than what they've used previously. If I look at the kind of happiness score, we have 78% of developers think that are happy with our tools. So that's like the satisfied or very satisfied category. So I'm not trying to oversell here a bit. Like we have 22% of devs who think we can be doing better, right? I'm pretty satisfied with that. That's about 80%. Working with them is really coming back to partnering, right? Understanding what their complaints are. For some people, it's going to take a while to get past what they want to use and what their preferences have been, right? And for some people, they may never get past that. So one, I don't think you should be striving for 100%. That's not the goal with this. But two, you should expect that some people are going to have challenging opinions, and you should understand that the best that you can. And after which, you continue to work to provide additional value. The real piece that I think brings people along is fundamentally when the tools become so good that they just have to select to use them. And that's when the automation becomes so deep and it goes so far that there's simply, it's better to use language, framework, whatever it is that you're pushing because of everything that surrounds it, right? You've built a very deep and automated universe around that. And so that's really, like I was trying to get at in the talk, that's really the method that we've used to bring people along and keep them not just satisfied with our tools, but actually like thinking that our tools are great to work with.
Got it. I have a couple questions around a monolith architecture. Let me quickly combine them. So how did you implement selective testing with such a monolithic code base? Any suggestions to set up a team like this in my company?
Sure. So I'm not sure, maybe you can comment on what you mean by a team like this, if you mean developer acceleration or something else more specific, while I answer the other part about selective test execution. So the selective test execution is really challenging here. We don't have a deterministic set. We can't figure out exactly which tests are going to be required, right? So for certain languages that are really strongly typed, you can actually deterministically figure out which test could possibly fail. So the way that we look at this is looking at test execution history over time and the probability that a test will fail. And then we take a best guess at which set of tests will give us coverage. The real key that unlocked this for us was really thinking about risk of breakage in production as a risk spectrum, as opposed to green and red. And so I find that most teams are thinking about this in terms of green and red, a build is good or bad. But even if a build is marked as green, we've all seen this. You push a green build to production and you still break production. And that's because a green build is not a guarantee that the build is not going to break production. So changing that assumption and thinking of this as a risk spectrum allowed us to say we can accept a bit more risk while being intentional about the risk that we're accepting in CI, because we have other mitigation factors in place. So for example, we have those quality checks and those resiliency patterns in place. We also have canary deploys in place for our monolith. And so many issues will be caught at that point, and we'll have a limited blast radius in production. And so that to me was the big difference around selective test execution and thinking about it. But again, the mechanics of it is really around probability, looking at the history of test execution. If you want to find out more about that, I'm happy to share more about that. Mozilla's done a bunch of work on this also, where I used to work, and they had a system in place there too. And I believe you can find out more information about that in the public as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I think the second part of the question was around how do I implement this in my organization? Any tips on sort of getting this conversation started and driving the change? Yeah,
so if you're talking about implementing a team like developer acceleration in general, the way that I see teams like this forming is really when you're a very small team, it's kind of, you need to have an automated build, and there's certain tools you want to have in place, and people kind of do this off the side of their desk, but generally it's the same people doing it. And as you get a bit bigger, all of a sudden, these tools require a bit more management, right? You decide, you know what, we need someone who's working on this full time, because it's not enough to fix it when it breaks. We don't want it breaking all the time. And so that's kind of, from what I've seen and what I have firsthand experience with, this kind of forms as what would typically be known as release engineering, and focusing on the build, because that's the first piece that you need. And then you kind of grow from there based on the needs of the business. But if you're looking at this, I think one way to look at it is to look at it comparatively. And so looking at it comparatively, all of the large companies have teams like this. And so if you look at our investment, the last time I looked at the numbers, we were about 16-to-1 developers to developer accelerators. And so this is a typical ratio that I've seen in other companies, but it might be more or less. But the point is that they're investing. And so you can think of companies that are much larger than ours. So I mean, Google's much larger, Facebook's much larger. They have much larger teams that are devoted to this. Microsoft as well, much larger team devoted to this. But fundamentally, all the companies that we talk to at the larger scale have teams specifically focused on scaling engineering and doing that through a team like this. So there's precedent for it. If you want to talk more about that and some of the specifics that are for your environment, message me. Like my DMs are open on Twitter, and we can chat there too.
Awesome. We have a question around a few questions around your test setup. The question says, what is your commit to deploy time, and how many tests do you typically run to ensure, how many tests do you run before deploys?
Sure. So our test framework for the monolith itself, I should clarify that Shopify is a monolith, and then there are a number of services around it, which maybe is implied by the fact that we have a tool like Services DB to manage those services. But for the monolith itself, like the average deploy time is around 50 minutes, and we push around 40 batch deploys per day. So we use continuous delivery with the monolith, and really with all of our services at Shopify. And our test suite is something around 140,000 tests, I believe. And so with selective test execution, we've cut that down under 100,000. Our initial goal with that project, like it was pretty ambitious, was to try and see if we could execute with approximately 10% of the tests executing. We didn't hit that, but we were able to execute with a much smaller number of tests. Another key that's gone into this that you can read about, again, on our engineering blog, so search for Shopify engineering and the blog will come up, is around our MergeQ v2 work. And so MergeQ v2 allows us to run a number of builds that are going to be ready to go out into production simultaneously. And this means that if we do actually get a bad build, we're ready for the next batch right away, and allows our deploys to keep flowing, even if a bad change makes its way into the build. This is like a vast simplification of what this does, but the real key here was this is a rethinking of how we do merges in order to keep deploys flowing, even if there's a bad change there. So that keeps the time to production down as well.
We have another question around monolith. What are some of the top problems that you've encountered with monolith?
Sure. I'd say the biggest problem with the monolith is it's difficult for new developers to get up to speed with the monolith, right? It's a large code base. There are lots of dependencies within it. And so I have a team that's actively working on this and trying to reduce this through a combination of componentization or packaging up certain pieces of it and cutting dependencies. There's certain pieces which are not actually part of our core or being extracted. The converse of that is that pieces that were built outside of the core and should have been in the core are being included in the core as well. So the solution that we're putting in place is to have a team that's working on active management of the code base itself, and left unchecked, it's, you know, in a monolithic application like this, it's a tragedy of the commons where nobody kind of owns the overall source code. And so over time, it diverges away from a place where it's really comprehensible to one where you need to have a bunch of ingrained knowledge, and it takes a long time to onboard and get up to speed with it. So I personally, I think that that's the biggest challenge that we face with the monolith. There's a bunch of others around the size and the number of deploys, and you know, even how many services you have to run locally for local development. But the biggest one by far, in my opinion, is the one that I mentioned.
Got it. So I think the second part to that question, based on sort of what you shared. So once the team is onboarded, do you think your current setup is faster than, or faster in terms of deploys and more simpler compared to a microservices or distributed environment?
I don't know if it's simpler. I think that what we would go for here, and the way that I've described this to a number of people who are thinking about these problems, is I want Shopify Rails developers to feel like they're developing a small Rails app and get the benefits of scale. And so a lot of what we're working on really should feel like a small service that you're developing in terms of the tooling and the way that you interact with it. But I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of that.
Yeah, I think it was, it's around wouldn't testing and deploys be simpler with a microservices environment?
So testing and deploys, yes, thank you. So testing and deploys can be simpler in that you don't need these advanced techniques, right? With a smaller code base, there's no need to work on selective test execution. Just execute all the tests. Like the timing isn't an issue. So there's some simplicity there. The trade-off in simplicity at that point is increased difficulty in diagnosing issues in production, right? All of a sudden, you're no longer debugging at the application level, but you're debugging at the network level, which can be really challenging as well. So I think there's pros and cons for these. It's our contention that that a majestic monolith is the way to go, and this is going to provide us with the kind of benefits that we need. And personally, I feel like it's a bit on me as a challenge to ensure that our team finds a way to get us there.
Awesome. I think there's a question around the test framework and sort of what process do you follow test framework to go with? I think you mentioned it was RSpec and Minitest. Those were the two.
I'm sorry, you cut out a bit for me. Was the question, what was the process to select one of them?
Yeah. What process did you follow to decide between the two frameworks?
Right. So we looked at the two. At the end of the day, we were very clear with all of our engineering team. One was not seen to be better than the other. Like, it was a coin flip. And so the way that we decided this was we selected the one that was in use in the monolith. So Minitest is in use in the monolith. And so that's the one that we've chosen by default. I'm not saying this is the best criteria, but at some point you need to pick a criteria, which could come down to flipping a coin. I think that this is a reasonable approach to selecting one. And whichever one we selected, we were going to have a group of developers, like I was talking about, who weren't happy with the choice. And so it's better to make a decision and move forward than to get stuck not making a decision, like I talked about at the beginning of the talk.
Great. Shifting gears, we have a question around using React Native for mobile apps. Did you notice any sluggish behavior with React Native for mobile apps? I tried it with Android, was not too happy with the performance.
It's one of these cases where it really depends on how you implement it, whether or not it works. So in our test, what we did is we had two teams who built the same application, one using React Native and the other building an iOS native application. And we looked to do a comparison between the two. And so that's where we're at. That's how we made that decision, is looking at those as a comparator. When we looked at this, I think it was 4 years ago, so it predates my time at the company, but again, the decision was documented. When we looked at it the first time, it wasn't even close. And so it was a non-starter, it wasn't the way to go. But when we looked at it this time, the performance characteristics for our type of application was close enough to make the decision to go with this. And I think that's a key. It's, no one technology is necessarily right for any given application, but certain technologies lend themselves more, and certain use cases lend themselves more to certain technologies, or don't expose some of the weaknesses in those technologies. And in this case, I'm not saying there's weaknesses. I'm just saying that this technology is working for our use cases at this point really well, and provides additional benefits to us, given that our web stack is on React as well. If that's something you're interested in, you can read more about that decision on our engineering blog as well. I don't mean to plug this all the time, but we do try and publish a bunch of the information around our decision-making process and the tech that we use there. So you can follow up on that one too.
I think I have one more question around React Native. What are some of the challenges that get fixed with React Native around cross-browser support?
React Native around cross-browser? This is outside of my my knowledge base, really. If you'd like to follow up with me, I can put you in touch with someone on the team who can give you a more in-depth answer. Like, I can give you one, but it's more of a superficial answer because I'm not deep in this technology.
Sure. I think we're through. We're through questions, guys. Thanks for putting in the questions. Some great questions. Lawrence, once again, thanks for spending a bunch of time going through these questions, and sharing your insights with us. Virtual round of applause for you. Thanks for coming on board as a speaker. It's a great talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It was great to push me to get this talk together and share this outside of the company. As I said at the end of the talk, I am interested in your feedback. Like I was talking about with that kind of bonus talk, this is one of the reasons to share opinions with other people. So if you have it, again, my DMs are open, or just tweet at me publicly, Mandel, and I'm happy to continue the conversation there. Thanks.